I think kindness is what holds the fabric of human society together, and I think we need to remember that. That despite differences that people might have, it's kindness and compassion and empathy that hold the fabric of human society together. And it's also, kindness is one of the most contagious things. In all the research I've ever done in science, one of the most contagious is kindness. So even when you think what you do isn't significant, you're always having a ripple effect. It's impacting loads more people than you think.
Okay, so welcome to the Humane Kind podcast. I'm Stephen.
And I'm Kelly.
And we've got the most amazing guest, one of our favourite people, Dr. David Hamilton, as our guest today. Welcome.
Well, thanks very much for that. That's very kind of you to say. I'm so pleased to be here. It's really, thanks a lot for inviting me.
Well, we're delighted, and the whole premise behind the podcast is kindness, as the name suggests, kindness to ourselves, kindness to others, kindness to animals. Charlie might make a wee appearance, and kindness to the universe and the planet. So I've said to you before, I've dubbed you the King of Kind. So.
I don't know if that's a fair assessment. It's funny how, people think of us sometimes differently than we have think in our own heads, don't we?
Absolutely.
Because, for me, I just do my thing, and I know that the challenges and flaws that I have that other people don't see. So, it always sounds different coming from someone else, because I couldn't, the idea of thinking of myself, oh my God, because I'm in awe of the people I think who are actually out there doing amazing things. I write about things and I keep other things, kind of quiet. I don't ever really broadcast things that I try to do. But I'm in awe of the real kings and queens of kindness who are actually out there, literally, physically doing things that are really helping people. Carers and all these other people are really, really on the front lines.
Yeah,
I think that's a beautiful way to look at it, especially after what we've been through over the last 18 months, 2 years. The people in the front line and helping us get through all this. So it's a good way to look at it. But you're keeping that title, but you can't escape it that easily.
You're still helping through.
I was trying to wriggle out there.
But you won't realise who you're helping unless people actually contact you and tell you, because you're writing the books and you're not seeing the other side of it, people reading it and then that helping them. So.
Yeah. I get a lot of lovely comments on social media, and I try my best to respond to the majority of them. Obviously, it's not always possible because some people, I might post 5 or 6 times a week across different platforms, and some people respond to comments from a fortnight ago, kind of thing. So it's impossible to keep on top. But I do like to respond to I probably manage about 70-80% of all comments. And I do that because if people have taken the time to say something nice, then it's only nice of me to reciprocate. I try to make the time to do that every day, even if it's just a little bit of time. But in a sense, I'm trying to show gratitude for people having taken the time to say something nice. Because it's always nice to know when someone says something nice to know that the person heard it, so to speak. Yeah. So in a sense, what I do with the comments is I'm just letting people know that thank you and I heard you, kind of thing.
It's a lovely thing to do. I don't mind admitting I'm still a bit of a fanboy and of yourself. And every time I get a like or you very kindly put some hearts on one of my posts yesterday, and I thought
that was such a beautiful post, though.
It's just it's one of those things that it always humbles me so much. Just somebody I admire, your writing's just so powerful. The thing that I admire about your writing the most is it's accessible. We were talking about the book The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. Is it Tolle?
Tolle.
Eckhart Tolle. I was talking to Edward Reed about that book, actually, and how you pronounce Eckhart Tolle or Tolle. And he just said Tolle sounds like the Scottish word for a jobby. So, no offence to Mr. Toll. But and we agreed about this. Like when I first read that book, maybe about, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, whenever it was, I couldn't wrap my mind around some of the concepts. But now it's different. You revisit it now.
Yeah. I read it again last month for the 3rd time, and I feel like there's so much that I've understood more. And probably if I read it again in a few years, there'll be other things. But I think when I first read it, around about the same time, probably about 8 years ago, I didn't understand, but the more you learn when you're on this kind of journey, these things start to become a bit clearer. So
because you hear
back.
Because you hear similar things in other voices and other books, don't you? And I think sometimes when you hear similar things, different times written in different ways, spoken in different ways, it kind of sinks in, doesn't it?
Yeah, it connects all the dots for you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry,
can I just say, I appreciate what you said about, my books being accessible.
Yeah.
Because, I remember when I was writing my first book, and I don't even know if I've ever shared this publicly, but I remember when I was writing my first book and I'd never written before. And, I failed my English at school, right? On my first attempt, I failed my English. And then in the middle of my PhD, so when you're doing a PhD, you have to, I don't know if it works this way in every university, but certainly in the university I went to, Strathclyde in Glasgow, you have to submit a report after 9 months, then another one after 21 months, and then your final thesis after 36. And that way, it allows the academic department to make sure that you're on the right track and you're not going off in random directions and that you're going to doing something of importance. And I'll never forget the day I submitted my 21-month report to my professor. And he came down. I was in the computer room. We had a wee room for the people in a research lab. And it's just lined, Apple Mac computers, and we used for our R&D and all that. And he came down. I was at one of the computers, and he had my 21-month report, and he threw it on the desk like that, and he slammed it, and he went, "Dave, this is a couple of expletives followed by shit." I swear it, and that was it. And it was horrifying to take. It wasn't that the chemistry wasn't good. It was what he was reading is it was badly written.
Right.
Yeah.
And he said, this was like a Tuesday. He said, Saturday morning. He said, you're going to do the whole thing again. You and I want to see you Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. And I've written through and I've circled all the little things that you've just not taken your time over. Even I'm drawing a chemical, my PhD, I was building molecules. And he said, even then, you've not even connected the lines together. You've just left a wee gap. That looks untidy and unprofessional. And circle that, hundreds of them. And some of my paragraphs, he said, look, what's that? Are you still 10-year-old? I could have written that better when I was 10. And he said he rewrote it underneath in a different kind of style. That's how he taught, not all the time, but it worked at that time. So literally I spent the whole day, and I stayed in the computer room till like 10 o'clock that night. I worked all day Wednesday till about 10 o'clock at night Thursday. On the Friday night, I was still in the computer room at 1 a.m. printing it out. Wow. I went in the next day, handed it to him, we went through it, and he said, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But then what he did is he sent me on a 6-week course to learn how to write.
Oh, wow.
And the thing is, I hadn't ever, here I was in the second year of my PhD. So this was 1993, 94 maybe. And so I was 23-year-old. And I had never really properly learned to write. I got through English at school because some of the concepts was just common sense. It wasn't that I was a good writer. I didn't get on with my English teacher when I was in second year at high school, and I ended up getting, and he kept giving me punishment exercise. My mum went into the school. It was just one of these unfortunate sequence of events that I fed into as well. I wasn't the best behaved as well, and I ended up in the bottom English class. And for when it came to do the O grades, what we now call standard grades, but it was called O grades when I was there. And I ended up in the bottom English section, and it was with people who had no chance of passing and nor had any interest. They were all just troublemakers, sometimes getting expelled, suspended from school, swearing in class. It was just, it was a class where no one was expected to pass, and the teacher just gave up. It was one of these, it was just like she just sat there. And anyway, I passed the O grade, and I was the only person in the class that passed. And I passed with such a good mark because a lot of it I felt at that age is common sense. It wasn't like you didn't really have to know how to write. It was just like organising your mind. So I then got put into one of the second highest higher sections. You know, when you're, again, it's A levels in England, higher in Scotland, second highest. But that's how I flunked badly, because it was assumed that you had a grounding in English, but I didn't. And so I just didn't understand. It was at a level way above what I'd actually learned. So like, it's daft as it sounds, structuring paragraphs and all that kind of stuff. It was just understanding, you know, reading poetry and understanding what it meant. So I ended up bottom of the class. In fact, I got in my prelim, I got 22% for paper 1 and 36% for paper 2. I was 24th out of 24 in order of merit. So I carried around in my psyche for years that I can't write. And so when I wrote my first book, I tried to impress everyone. So when I was writing the first draft, I was using a lot of big words, big science words. And in my head, what I was doing was I was trying to impress people with my writing, but try to get people to think how clever I was and say, oh, look how clever David is. Look at all the big words he's using. Look how he's used fancy language and tweaked all that in, and how clever is David. I gave it to my mum to read, and she didn't understand it. I was using too many big words and complicated concepts, and that was absolutely humbling, because my mum was the first person to read anything I'd ever written. And she said that, you know, some of it understood. It sounds really good, but most of it I didn't really understand, and that was humbling. And I thought, from now on, in my head, everything I write is going to be written in such a way that my mum and my Auntie Jean, who is my mum's big sister, who is my mum, still is my mum's big sister, can understand. And they've got no background in science, no qualifications at school, and that's been my mantra since back in 2003 when I wrote the first draft of my first book. That's what's guided me the entire way. Is this relatable and accessible enough that my mum and my Auntie Jean could read it and actually understand what I'm saying? In which case, a lot of times you've got to get rid of the big words, and you've got to get rid of trying to sound clever. In other words, to write a book, I've learned you have to take your ego right out of the book completely and write and serve, really.
I love that. That's amazing.
What was your hope, like, when you wrote your first book? Is the thought that counts your first book?
It's a thought that counts, yeah.
So you go way back to then, and you're obviously starting out this career as an author. You've given up a fantastic career that you had. What was your hope then? Were you hoping to impress? Was your ego overtaken a little bit, or did you want to reach people?
I'd say the latter. I wanted to reach people. You know, what drove me? In fact, when I decided to leave the pharmaceutical industry, I was at a personal development seminar run by Tony Robbins, you know, the really big, tall American motivational.
Love Tony. I've been to see Tony Robbins as well. We did the virtual one.
I did Unleash the Power Within, Cardiff, 1999, and I resigned from my job the next day back at work.
Oh, I love it.
As it was. He said, like, make a decision. He got us doing this big meditation. Think of a time in your life when something happened that if it didn't happen, your life might have gone another way. So you now make a decision that'll change the course of your life. And that's me, I'm leaving my job. And what I saw myself doing, what felt right to me, I'd always known it all the way through, even working in the pharmaceutical industry, that I was about education and communication, teaching and inspiring people with kindness and ideas about how to make a difference, that kind of stuff. And so that was my drive. But when it actually got down to writing, what I really left to do is I saw myself speaking. I knew I would write, but it was a kind of backward, a kind of further deeper down, because I knew I was scared. And so when I actually tried to write, I was writing from an ego perspective initially. I just wanted to impress people. I wanted to say, look, I can write, even though I failed English at school. And my professor sent me on this course, and he said my 21-month report was, you know, expletive shite. You know, even though that was in my head, that here I can write. Look how clever I am. Look at all the big words that I'm using, and look how I've structured that to make it, you know, I'd structured paragraphs to make it complicated. You know, what's the point of that? Yeah. You know, because the only person that reads it and thinks, well, how clever are you, is myself. You know, nobody else. The first person to read that sentence will glaze over. So I had to learn to take my ego out of it.
No, I really like that, because very similar to you. I left school thinking I was stupid. I left after fourth year, didn't sit my higher exams. And I was going through a bad time at high school, but it was just labelled. And I would have been in your English class as well if I was at school with you. But then I went back to uni. I went to college first and went back later, and I'm now a teacher. But then that's inspired me, because I remember all those bad experiences of people making me feel like that. And that's what drives me as a teacher, because I want to be that person that I needed when I was younger. So it always comes from your past experiences, like you with the writing.
Yeah, I think your experience. I definitely feel like your experiences really shape not just who you are, but they shape what you bring to the table in any situation, don't they? They shape, the way that the way you communicate, the way that you do the things that you do. I find.
I think it's interesting. I'll try and segue seamlessly into your new book just now. Tony Robbins is an interesting one. We love Tony Robbins, and we did UPW. We did the virtual one last year.
We were supposed to go and it was cancelled.
But Tony Robbins is again, to the people that perhaps haven't seen what the work that he actually does and participated in one of his courses, it's along the same lines of the stuff that you talk about in your new book. Things like Reiki, mindfulness, meditation, they're shrouded in a little bit of stigma at times to people that, again, perhaps don't fully understand it.
Yeah.
But again, I think the good thing from what you do is you're backing this, and this is what your new book's about, Why Woo-Woo Works, is you're backing all that up with the science there.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I kind of try to do, because I think a lot of these subjects are kind of unfairly dismissed as woo-woo or quackery or pseudoscience. But most of the time when they're dismissed in that way, people are not dismissing it from a position of authority, as if they're saying, I know all the research, and from my having read the whole field body of research myself, I am now declaring this is woo-woo or pseudoscience. You'll find that, 99.99% of the time when people dismiss things as pseudoscience or that, it's because they don't know.
Yeah.
They call them woo-woo. It's because they're not experts, and they actually do not know that there is a heck of a lot of science available for these kind of things. And it's just calling things woo-woo or pseudoscience often, not always, but often betrays our own ignorance of the available research or the available philosophical thought that's gone into this whole kind of field. So even, in fact, I remember when I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and I brought up the notion of the mind-body connection. Some of my friends referred to it as quackery. I talked about meditation as well, and they called it quackery. And it wasn't meant unkindly. We were all having a laugh, but they sometimes kind of joked and in a friendly way, but at the same time that was what they believed. The way you take the piss out of your pals sometimes, and you're just having a laugh, but you do think they're into that kind of stuff, but you don't dislike them for it. They're still your friend, kind of thing. And that's how it was for me. The idea that I said the mind must impact the body, and they called it quackery, and that meditation could have real physiological effects. It was also referred to as quackery. So this is before people started using woo-woo. This was in the mid to late 90s. And I remember when because most people in the industry at that time just dismissed the placebo effect as, it's just an artifact. It's just those people would have improved anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But I started questioning that, because the data didn't really suggest that. And if you look really closely, then that couldn't possibly be true. So I remember finding some research in the academic library and in the research facility I worked at, finding already even then there was evidence for research showing that when you take a painkiller, but you believe it's a placebo, you take a placebo, but you believe it's a painkiller, your belief or I expect my pain to go away actually fiddles around with your brain chemistry, and your brain manufactures its own version of morphine. So belief was actually having a neurological effect, and therefore a physiological effect. I remember sharing that with my pals, and they were like, "Oh, come on!" They're reading it and they're going, and it kind of gets through, and you're like, "Wow, this is amazing!" And that allowed me to then start talking about meditation, and they're presenting data on meditation as well. And it's the stuff we call woo-woo and quackery. Most of the time, we just don't know that there's stuff that's been done. Really, oftentimes really good, really clever research. And, so I decided in the book, I'm going to pick subjects that I notice get unfairly labelled in that kind of way. When I was aware of research that existed for all of these fields. I couldn't possibly tackle every single subject. There's far too many. But I tackled subjects that I feel are often unfairly dismissed in that way, and other subjects that I knew I had already looked at some research myself about that would fit into this kind of thing.
I've always felt that within Scotland there's a certain level of cynicism, but you've travelled the world. Is it just Scotland? There's this cynicism about this type of subject global? Or is there certain places you've been to that are a bit more receptive?
I think
yes and no. Again, it depends where you go.
Yeah.
I suppose not just even within the same country. So I found, I've been in company in California, in Los Angeles, and everyone's and that company's totally into it.
Yeah.
But yet I've been in other company in the same place, and they're like, oh, come on, that's a lot of crap. And it really depends. I guess it depends. You get pockets of people everywhere, I think, that, but there are certain countries where there are more of that kind of stuff. I mean, I read somewhere there was more Reiki masters in New Zealand than anywhere else. I don't know if that's right. I know somebody just posted that on my social media, and so I don't know if that's true, but certainly everyone I've ever met from New Zealand, not that that's a scientific statement to make, but certainly everyone I've ever interacted with from New Zealand was totally into Reiki and all that kind of stuff.
That's cool.
I love it because, as you said, my group of friends, not many of them are into these things, and I've always thought we were weirdos because we were. And
I love that word, weirdo. That's a Scottish word, a weirdo.
They would just be like, all right, whatever. You would recommend these things and be like, okay. But I love when I've got something to back it up. Like, I remember when I went to Tony Robbins, and it was Master Stephen Cole was on, and he showed a picture, and it showed your energy field. Like, you can actually scan that, and that was the first time that I'd seen that. So I love being able to say to people, look at the proof, look at this.
Because what you're seeing in those kind of things, and again, this is also dismissed as woo-woo because one person hears someone else calling it woo-woo, who hears someone else calling it woo-woo, and then somebody mentions it in a book as woo-woo as well, and all of a sudden everybody's reading all that, and they're just, without having investigated themselves. But what these kind of things actually show is they're imaging the body's biofield. Right now, like an MRI scanner. What an MRI scanner is doing, it's essentially measuring blood flow. It's measuring, atoms. It's measuring atoms being spun in a magnetic field, and what that does is it tell you where there's more blood flow in particular parts. But an ECG and an EEG, they're measuring electric fields. That's called, what they're actually measuring is biofields or bioelectric fields. And when I say the word biofield, a biofield is just a definition of the source of an electric or magnetic field. So if I was to plug my phone into a wall socket, then you just call it electricity. But in physics terms, that means there's a flow of an electric current. There's an electric field around flowing through that wire. And as a consequence, there's a magnetic field associated with it. Whenever you put an electric field that way, you'll get a magnetic field going, at 90 degrees to it, a magnetic field at 90 degrees. Now, whenever you generate the electric field or the magnetic field, not from a wall socket, where you call it electricity, but from a biological process, which is occurring all the time. Whenever sodium, potassium, or calcium, for example, flow in and out of your cells, then that creates an electric current, which ultimately is an electric field. And so it's a physics definition. A bioelectric field or a biomagnetic field is just a definition used in physics to define the source of the electric or magnetic field. And the reason why I know that is because I've been formally studying mathematics and physics. I'm in the fifth year of a university degree that I've been doing part-time in mathematics and physics. So I come across this kind of thing. We actually have to calculate the intensity of electric and magnetic fields and stuff. But what's interesting is most people who call a biofield a woo-woo concept just don't know physics.
Yeah.
Because it's an actual physics term kind of thing.
They won't question being able to phone someone at the other side of the world and how these things work, but they'll question something like that.
Yeah. And so when some of these imaging technologies, what they're actually doing, they're really just imaging electric or magnetic fields, that's all. But they're using computer software that's giving colours to the intensity at different parts, and that's all. It just sounds and looks kind of woo-woo because it's it's like a kind of Reiki master doing it. But in effect, it's just a very rudimentary way of imaging a biofield. All it is imaging electric fields or magnetic fields, which do actually change depending on stress levels or blood flow, because blood flow changes depending on stress. Mm-hmm. And so what you get is different amounts of heat coming off the body. You get different blood flow, so the electric fields will change. And so it's not actually rocket science, but it is science. But some people call it pseudoscience only because they don't really know what's actually being displayed. Yeah.
It's one of my favourite books of yours is firstly the little book of kindness. As you know, my daughter Phoebe and I, we sit and read that most nights. We sit and read a little bit and pick it apart and discuss it. But it's quite interesting talking about stress here, and the opposite of stress, as you say in that book, is kindness. Yeah,
absolutely. That's one of my favourite things ever to have come to understand, is that physiologically speaking, kindness is the opposite of stress. I often, in the days when I was presenting in front of a live audience, and even still on Zoom, we use the chat function, I would ask the audience, what do you think is the opposite of stress? And literally 99% of people will say, oh, it's peace, or it's calm, it's tranquility, that or thereabouts. And that's a logical answer. It's the exact same answer I would have given. But it turns out those are not the opposite of stress. Those are the absence of stress. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Physiologically speaking, the opposite of stress is kindness, or it's how kindness feels. Because when you feel stressed, and I draw your attention to the word feel, when you feel stressed, it's the feelings of stress that's producing stress hormones. I think most people nowadays have heard of adrenaline and cortisol and even norepinephrine. But these don't just magically appear in your brain and body because you're in a stressful situation. They appear, or they're produced because of how stress feels. Mm-hmm. Because two people could be in the same situation. One person feels stressed about it and the other person doesn't. The person who's feeling stressed, they're producing higher levels of stress hormones because of how they feel. So I draw a parallel with kindness and say, when you be kind because of how that feels, instead of stress hormones, we produce kindness hormones. And the main kindness hormone is oxytocin. It's involved in reproduction, but it's also goes by affectionate names as the love drug, the hug drug, the hugging hormone, the cuddle chemical, that kind of thing. But it's produced because of how that feels. Right. So, but if you chart the effects of the kindness hormone, you'll find that they have opposite effects a lot of the time from what stress hormones do. So what you actually see is that kindness physiologically, because of how it feels, is opposite to stress because of how stress feels. In fact, one study in psychology even charted a bit of this. They texted people every night in the evening and asked them to give 2 number scores. So the first number score was on a scale 0 to 10. What would you say today has been your average level of stress? So if 0 was no stress and 10 was maximum 10 out of 10 stress, what would you say has been your average level of stress? That's your first number score. Second number score, to the best of your memory, how many kind things can you remember having said or done today? Was it between this ballpark or this ballpark or this ballpark? And that gave the researchers another number score. Now, when they cracked through all the data, what happened is on the days when the kindness number score was high, the stress number score was low. But on the days where the stress number score was high, the kindness number score was low. And it was like a seesaw. They were exactly opposite each other. But what was amazing or interesting out of this, it didn't mean that when you're being kind, that stressful things don't happen. It doesn't mean that at all. What it actually meant is when you're being kind, because of how that feels, it just takes the sting out of some of the stressful events. So the same things happen, it just doesn't sting, it doesn't feel the same, because you're literally buoyed, you're elevated a little bit by how kindness feels. So that's, in a psychological level, they're opposites, but physiologically as well. Stress increases blood pressure, stress hormone, but kindness hormones reduce blood pressure. So there's a lot of equal and opposite kind of things.
So other than saying the opposite of stress, how would you define kindness? Like people might do things, but they're trying to be kind, but they're doing it for an ulterior motive. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
For me, kindness is something that comes from the heart. Like you're doing it because you believe that you're doing something good, or you believe that you're helping someone, or you're making an attempt to help someone. So I think real kindness has to come from a space of actually you're really trying to help. You're doing it not because I'm trying to impress people, but because I'm doing something that's honest and heartfelt.
I think as well, and I can say this because we've spoke about it before, but I think people overcomplicate what kindness perhaps is. And I think the example you used before was, your mum making you a sandwich and a cup of tea. That's kindness.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we've talked about this before. Because when I was writing my last kindness book, The 5 Side Effects of Kindness, I was over visiting my mum and dad, and I was just chatting to my mum, and I said, what's the last kind thing you did? And she got off kind of flustered, as if, I don't know. And we're trying to then think of what comes under the title of a kind act. We sometimes think, is it something I have to plan and then go out and do, kind of thing, and we overthink it. And I said, Mum, and she said, I don't know. And I said, Mum, you've just made me a cup of tea and a sandwich. So that was kind. She said, but you're just my son. And I said, but it doesn't matter. You did it because you care. So it's kindness. You did it because I came into the house and you felt maybe I could do with something to eat. And I said yes, because I hadn't had any lunch yet. And you made me a cup of tea and a sandwich. That was really kind, and I'm very grateful. And it just picked my mum up a wee bit as well. And I think a lot of the times we don't realise that the things we're doing is really kind a lot of the time, but we overthink it sometimes. And most kindnesses are just the small things.
I think it's people actually taking time to reflect on not only the kind things that have happened to them that day, but the kind things they've done as well. Because like I'll get up in the morning and make the kids breakfast and whatnot, make you your coffee and things like that, and you don't think about these things because it is, you just certain people are just wired a certain way, and you just get on with it where you're not placing that thought and emphasis on it.
Yeah, and there's some people as well who just are so kind all the time, but they don't take the time to be kind to themselves, and I think that can be quite dangerous as well. Like I was listening to Gaber Matti, and we'd spoke about him before, and he was talking about an example was this woman who she was just constantly doing stuff for everyone else, and then she developed breast cancer, and she was stage 4. That's terminal, isn't it? So when she developed it, she started doing some therapy, and she talked about some of the trauma she had been through as a child, and it actually helped her cancer, and it started to it didn't go away, but it helped, and she lived. She got told she only had a year to live, and 10 years later she was still alive. Wow. And he was saying how she was always being kind to everyone else, but she wasn't being kind to herself by stopping and sitting with those emotions. And I see so many people, you probably were one of those people when we first met, just constantly doing everything kind for everyone else, but not stopping to actually be kind to themselves and remember that they need to come first as well. And that ties in with your book as well, I Love Me.
Yeah, because in fact, I would say in my experience, being kind to yourself is what most people struggle with. Because I think, most people I know, including yourselves, are just nice people, just kind people. You probably wouldn't even define yourself in that way because you just do what you do. And say the things that you say, but for most people I know, they are genuinely good people. But when it comes to self-kindness, turning inwards. Some of us do too much, and spread ourselves kind of thin, and we forget that I need to recognize my own needs as well. Like self-kindness can actually be, I'm going to say no right now, or maybe not yet, or I could say maybe later. But the reason I'm saying that is because I'm doing it to support my own mental health, or recognizing that my mental health, I need a little bit of extra space, or I might just take some time to myself, or I might go and treat myself, because in this moment of treating myself, I'm doing something that supports my own mental health, kind of thing. I've struggled in the past with depression and anxiety. Anxiety still is something that I deal with on a fairly frequent basis, and there's certain things that I find are really helpful, and I do them intentionally because they're supports for mental health. Like I play tennis most days, because I love it, and it's very scientific because there's so many things to learn and understand, and then it's continual improvement. And so I partly do it not just because it's good exercise, but because it supports my mental health. I love to cook. I love to prepare right from scratch, everything from and cut and chop and then build and create. I love that, again, because it supports my kind of mental health. But I'm doing it out of self-kindness. Even though I'm serving someone else by making the food, I'm doing it because I'm doing it for me, because I need to do this, because it's part of what I call self-kindness, because I'm doing it because I need it for myself.
There's a couple of things I want to pick up on. Firstly, the beauty in someone like yourself that is supposed to be vulnerable and saying, I do struggle. And I think that, again, it's probably why I gravitate towards you and Kelly as well, because there is that, there's that real edge, and then going off on a tangent slightly when you're cooking. I love cooking as well.
That's great.
What type of, you say you like to create things from scratch? Do you follow a recipe, or do you?
I've got some cookbooks, mostly. The ones that I use the most are written by people that are friends of mine, actually, like Plant Power Doctor, Dr. Gemma Newman. She's Plant Power Doctor on that's her book's called The Plant Power Doctor. She's a GP, but she's all about plant power, cooking using the power of plants, vegan, that kind of stuff. So another one written by Alan Desmond, who used to be called the Devon Gut Doctor. He's a consultant gastroenterologist, but he's had amazing reversals of gut problems in people by radically changing their diet. Rather than just always prescribing medicine, they often prescribe a lifestyle intervention. So it's mostly kind of plant-based in fact, it's entirely plant-based that I cook.
It's interesting because I saw you share a post from Dr. Laura Freeman about the stats about a plant-based diet, and I screenshotted it, but my phone's up there filming just now. So that was, again, the things, dramatically cut, just overall deaths. It wasn't specifically about plant-based diet. It was just about, improve
the planet.
But it's fascinating the impact that a plant-based diet can have on the planet. We watched the latest David Attenborough documentary, and it was fascinating, some of the stats on that. So
I'm a huge believer that I'm passionate about climate change, and I'm a huge believer that a plant-based diet could make a huge difference, an absolutely massive difference. I'd love to say that my reasons for switching to a plant-based diet was for the climate, but it was actually because I lost my dog. I think we've talked about this before. And I was, my dog Oscar had bone cancer. He passed away when he was just 2 years and 2 months old. Just very young for a Labrador to have bone cancer. And I remember a couple of months later, I was driving to a holistic retreat centre to go to a talk. And it's Lendrick Lodge. It's owned by my friend Stephen in Victoria. And I was driving up there, and I pulled over at a woolen mill. It's one of these places dotted around Scotland that sell lots of clothes, and you can get some food and coffees and stuff like that. And I thought, there's a coffee shop in there. I'll go in and get a coffee. And I parked my car right at the fence, and in the field, and you see them a lot all the time. I just hadn't really paid that much attention. There's a big Highland cow. In fact, there's a couple of them. And I got in my car, and this cow had come right over, and it had a huge, enormous big head, massive big head and huge big eyes. And it came right over out of curiosity. I got out of the car and I looked at it, and I just looked right in its eyes, and you could literally feel its emotion. Because when Oscar was suffering, I got so close to him on his last few months, because we tried everything. We tried everything you can possibly imagine to save his life. I mean, everything you could possibly imagine to save his life, and just bonded so incredibly. He used to sleep beside us and everything. It was just bonded so much with him. And I'd really felt a connection with an animal in a way that I didn't know was possible. I had no frame of reference in that way. I'd never been a parent to an animal before, the primary responsibility. And I'm sitting looking at this Highland cow, and I could see in its huge big eyes, and big dark eyes, and I just feel its emotions, and I just broke down crying. I started crying, and I was crying not even so much out of the loss of Oscar, but at the recognition of the emotions and the feeling and the sentience. Not that I didn't think of other animals as sentient, but sometimes you don't do it to the same degree. Yeah. You say, oh, that's a sentient being, but yeah, you're saying the words, but do you really feel? Do you really know what you're saying? And for me, it was, I really understand what I'm saying here. I saw and felt the sentience, and I just broke down crying, and that I never ate a piece of meat again after that.
I think a lot of people just don't make the connection. I know that I didn't until 2 years ago, the connection between the animal on the field and what's on your plate. Yeah. My friend was over at the weekend, and she is such an animal lover, but she still eats meat, and I just laugh at her, and I'm like, oh, well, what's that on your plate? But my mum was in as well, and my sisters, and they were talking about meat. And then they said something about lamb, and my friend's like, oh, I don't eat lamb, those poor wee lambs. And I'm like, but what about that steak you're eating? That's a cow. And she's like, oh, I know, but they just don't make that connection.
I know.
For me, when I first became vegan, it was for health reasons, and it was through watching some Netflix documentaries and reading some books. And if it had just been for health reasons, I don't know if I would have stuck to it. But as soon as I started learning about the animals and making myself more aware of the process of how the meat gets onto your plate, that totally changed it for me. Like something in my head just clicked, and I couldn't do it since. I love animals, and I could not think of eating one again.
Yeah, I think everyone has different experiences, and I think many people who've become vegan or even vegetarian have done so because they've had an experience. And there are a lot of people are making a choice for climate change as well. And so I think everyone's got their own kind of reasons, I suppose, and people come to different conclusions at different points in life, don't they, for different reasons.
Yeah.
I'm going to go off on a tangent slightly, but I want to take you back to the classroom where you mentioned the English class. Not that I want you to relive that experience.
I'm going to give you some therapy now.
But again, bringing it back to your new book, Why Woo Woo Works, and one of the chapters Kelly was particularly interested in is his understanding. You mentioned some people kind of swearing in class, and these are kids that had kind of given up. So I think one of the chapters in there, you talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and that's something you've studied at length, and it's something we really wanted to talk to you about. We think it's important, and you were delighted that it was covered in the book.
Yeah.
You're better at remembering all the facts. I just I watch it and then I realise and then go with it.
If you work in that field, you probably have a much richer understanding than I do. I'm good at taking in facts and stuff. But, one of the reasons I included research on, it was a chapter I was writing on the mind-body connection, but, not just placebo effect and visualization, which I had included earlier in the book, but I was writing about how and more long-term emotions, a consistent pattern can actually have a physical effect in the context of trauma. And I remember when I didn't know much about adverse childhood experiences, which are summarised as ACE, an adverse childhood experience. And what astonished me when I was researching was that the number of different types of ACE, so there's different types of them, categories, and the number of different types that a child has is directly correlated with a propensity for mental illness later in life, for chronic pain later in life, for a host of different types of physical condition, more likelihood of diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, higher increases in cancer, depression, heart, a whole host of different things. And so what I try to explore in that chapter of the book is, how is it that happens, and what can we do about it? Because when it's ingrained in us to be fearful because we've been traumatized, then it puts the nervous system on alert. But the nervous system stays on alert, and it's like a background effect that we've become so used to we don't even notice it. But what that stress program that's running is doing is, depending on the circumstances and environment that we find ourselves in, that stress program is added to everything else. And so what you can often find is higher likelihood of certain things. I mean, for example, a psychology professor, Lydia Temashok, categorized a personality type as cancer prone. She actually called it cancer prone. In her research, she found that people who had type C personality, cooperative, unassertive, suppressing negative emotion, tended to have higher incidences of certain cancers. And it wasn't that the personality caused cancer, it doesn't mean that at all. But different personality styles, different personalities have different coping styles, which means different levels of stress. Yeah. And when you add that to the cauldron of a person's other life experiences, their diet, their environment, life as it happens, and mix them all together in the cauldron, what you find is there's a higher likelihood of a type C personality developing certain forms of cancer, just like there's a higher likelihood of one aspect of type A personality, like hostile aggressive, developing cardiovascular disease. So what I found interesting is how ways of coping and stuff actually can manifest in different health conditions, and that tracks back to then kids or adults who were traumatized as children for one or more of a number of different reasons, and how that literally lodges in the body. But what's interesting is there are techniques that can help us to really gently get rid of some of that trauma. And as we get rid of it from our mind, it also gets rid of it from the body as well, because the mind and the body are in synchronization. And so sometimes what you find is healing a trauma in the mind does actually have a positive effect in the body as well. It doesn't mean it'll always cure something, but it has a positive effect in some kind of ways, from increased immune function, or better immune function, or from better cardiovascular function, or better ability to just be healthy kind of thing.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I got into it through when I was at university, but it probably came again from trying to heal things in myself and to help my family who were struggling with some things. And I was looking for an answer, because I was like, why are people behaving this way, like a child in particular? And there was no answers. And I came across the ACE study, but I came across it, and then within that year, it just kind of blew up in Scotland. And it was my friend, she's passed now, Tina Hendry. She had viewed the Resilience film, and she'd heard about ACEs because she was in the police. But it was actually through the, I can't remember what, it was like a certain department she worked in. And they viewed it 10 years ago, but nothing really big came. The original I can't remember their name, sorry, I told you I'm terrible with facts. They came over and spoke to the police, and then Tina remembered this, and she was the one who did the viewings for the Resilience movie, and that's what kind of got it known in Scotland. Yeah. But for me, when I was looking at it, I think it's important to understand about it, but like going forward, you don't need to focus too much on what the ACEs were. It's just knowing that trauma is going to have an effect on the future. And for me, all the kind of things that I've used to heal myself, and if I was working with kids, is all the things that you talk about in your book. It's your like meditations, it's getting into nature, like the foods as well. It's a number of things that's going to heal you.
So a lot of those things, what they do is they put the nervous system from a state of alert, sympathetic dominance, into what's called parasympathetic dominance, where it's the parasympathetic, the rest and relax, that's being trained to run the show. And you really can't train it. I've got a little device, but the company called HeartMath, I use it quite a lot in my meditation practices. And that shows me how I can literally train my nervous system to respond, in a more calm way rather than a spiky, stressful way. And it's just training, and it's just breath work. It's breathing and training over periods of time. But, one of the things I meant to say, and I think you kind of alluded to it there, when I was researching for one of my other books, and I put it in this one as well, there's evidence that shows that young children who are neglected, they actually develop holes in this frontal cortex, the orbital frontal cortex. It's behind the orbits of the eyes. It grows, and it doesn't really grow according to a genetic program, but almost entirely within the environment that a child finds itself in. And, PET scans showed neglected children had holes in their orbital frontal cortex, not actual holes, but the PET scan where it's shown as the depth of connections and stuff. So there was areas that are much less connectivity, much lower power. And it's no surprise that in one of the papers that was written on it, when scientists took brain scans of 40 people or 20 people who were in hospital for having committed acts of violent assault, all of them had holes in the orbital frontal cortex. And the paper was arguing, saying, is it entirely their fault? Yes, people have to be accountable for their actions, but how much of that is their background, the trauma that occurred to them as children that actually knocked out the power of the orbital frontal cortex, which meant that to an average person put under a little bit of provoking might be able to just breathe and walk away, but someone else whose brain has been badly affected, its brain growth has been badly affected, then they might not have the ability to just turn the other cheek, so to speak, and walk away. It's not quite the same.
Yeah.
And that's what the paper, I believe that's what the paper was arguing,
I think you'd find if you went to a prison, most people in there, they've got a high ACE score, and they've been affected.
I think as well as taking this level of understanding and applying it in everyday life, people can be judgmental. You walk by someone in the street that's perhaps begging for some money. Nobody chooses that life. Addiction, things of that nature. It's not a choice. It's
people trying to deal with their pain and they don't know how to.
Yeah. So I think it's approaching it and bringing it back to kindness. As it is, just having that kinder view of the world and perhaps a level of understanding that, well, I don't know their story, but there is a story. There's absolutely a story.
I'm glad you're saying that, Stephen, because I think we often don't realise that that's what kindness is as well. I think, remember earlier, I think you mentioned we often overthink it. And sometimes what we do is we think, as we define kindness in our own heads, that kindness is a physical act I go out and do. In actual fact, kindness is exactly what you said. It's just recognising that everyone else has a story. And kindness is refraining from judging someone's actions and behaviour. I sometimes think of it as, I remember years ago, my partner Elizabeth and I were on a plane, and it was really pouring with rain. It was all cloudy and stormy. And I was pointing that out. And then Elizabeth said, but quite soon the plane will rise above the clouds to a place where the sun is always shining. And I thought, what an amazing metaphor for life, because oftentimes people present their cloud front, their storm front, and that's what we're seeing. But maybe what part of what kindness is trying to poke through that, trying to see through that and recognise that underneath that storm front is sunshine. And maybe my job today isn't just to judge that person or even react to the storm, but to try to see through. And maybe if I can see more of the light, more of the sunshine, I might just help that to build enough to burn off some of the clouds by itself, by just me noticing that, or being willing to see that rather than see the storm front.
When I was at uni, I remember a lecturer came and she said behaviour is a form of communication, and that's always stuck with me when I'm in schools. But even looking at people, like adults as well, when someone's behaving a certain way, other people might judge them as like, oh, they're angry. They're not angry, they're feeling angry, and that's, to me, a secondary emotion where they're in pain. It's something else deeper down. So rather than judging that, asking what's happened to them, or
I was interested to know, obviously the world's changed, and even the way that we're communicating just now has changed greatly. You were obviously used to going out and delivering speeches and things of that nature. What was your preference in terms of writing books, being behind your computer and typing away and creating that? Or was it talking to a live audience, specifically a live audience, and giving your message that way? Did you have a preference?
Initially, I found it really difficult to adapt because, for years I've done a large amount of talks. In fact, there was a time when I was averaging 100 to 150 talks or workshops a year, mostly in the UK. And so I'm speaking a lot, and that's a lot of emails back and forward with the organisers, booking travel and all that. It was a lot of work. And I gradually scaled that down a wee bit, by half probably. But, I really love being in front of a live audience. And part of that is I kind of feed off the energy, because I like to entertain a wee bit, and I do it intentionally because people are more likely to remember something if they're not stressing to remember. So I kind of break things up with maybe a wee funny story or a wee kind of funny example, that kind of thing. And I remember and I love doing that, and I love the interaction and chatting with people before and chatting people afterwards. I remember the first time I had to do a Zoom talk to a group on, just shortly into the pandemic. And I can't remember how many people were on it, but I was in front of the camera and I could just see myself in front of the camera, because it was a webinar format. Because, I don't know if it's the same now, but certainly back then, as if it's 20 years ago, but even just 18, I think even the video platforms have improved. Now you can have everyone in video, but then even 18 months ago, having too many people in video kind of slowed down the speed. So most time when I was speaking, it was just my face. And so I cracked a wee funny joke near the start of this talk, the same place I crack jokes every time I do that talk. And I said the wee thing like that. And I always kind of pause, because what happens in front of the audience, as you see people laughing, and some people go, ah, and so I just get used to waiting in the laughter. And I was doing the Zoom thing, and I did wee thing, I went, and there's nobody there. For all I know, because I can't see anyone, for all I know, the internet could be down, and I'm just talking to my own face, And the sudden realization that there's no one there, and they I don't know if anyone was laughing. My face flushed. I actually felt genuinely embarrassed, I don't even know if anyone was laughing, if they're thinking, God's sake, fair enough, you could crack that joke in front of an audience, but come on, I'm in my living room here, But I got used to it quickly. I found myself presenting a lot and Zooming. I got to really enjoy it, because it felt as if it's a way that, I think so much of life is adapting, isn't it? You can't just have everything your own way all the time. You have to adapt to as things change. And I took on it as this is a challenge, an opportunity to adapt and find a new way to communicate. And so I've come to really enjoy, doing podcasts on Zoom. Every podcast I ever did beforehand was just on audio. But here I'm doing podcasts on video, and it's great. I love it because I can see your face, and you laugh at my jokes, which is much for that. But it's really cool. The one thing I found unusual is I've written all of my books in coffee shops, except my very first book. I wrote most of it in the middle of the night, but all of my other books I've written mostly in coffee shops. And when and I just literally just properly started writing shortly before the pandemic started. And so I wasn't able to do my writing in coffee shops. So I found that challenging at first, because when I'm in a coffee shop, if I get to a bit when I'm thinking, a wee bit difficult to convey an idea, then I just look around me for a second, take a wee sip of my coffee, bit of relax. I like that. It's always nice relaxing music and it's a nice vibe, and I get back into it. But if the same situation occurs in the house, I go, oh my God, I'll end up going to emptying the dishwasher, or I'll put a washing on, and then I've got to hang the washing up, and I'm more distracted at home. And so I found it took a lot longer to write the book at home. Luckily, I had the time, but it took longer to write at home than it usually. I'd say in a coffee shop, I get more work done in a 3 to 4 hour sitting than I would do in a whole day at home.
Yeah. Well, sorry, on you go.
I think it takes away as well that home work, like the different settings. I think a lot of people have struggled with that and
doing everything in the same room.
Yeah, and you can't switch off. I found that a struggle when I was teaching from a computer, which was a nightmare. But I found that hard. You couldn't switch off. You couldn't just leave your work and go home and change your scenery.
Yeah. Well, you moved back to that writing in the coffee shop?
Not yet, actually, not yet. To be honest, I've finished the latest book. I mostly do it. Well, I've not written anything since Why Woo Woo Works.
Oh, right, okay. I thought you were meaning you started another.
No, when I do other bits of work in a coffee shop, if I've got a wee bit of writing to do, like an article or a blog or sometimes I do it maybe just a couple of times a week. But when I'm writing a book, it's 4 or 5 times a week I do that. So at the moment, because we're not fully out, I'm not fully out of the water yet and stuff, and I've just kind of got used to doing it in the house at the moment, but I've not got the same urgency. Like I don't have the book deadline anymore. So,
do you have an idea for your next book without giving anything away?
Absolutely not a clue.
No.
I mean, I have a partial clue for something, but it probably wouldn't be the next book. But something I experimented with and Why Woo Woo Works is I put a mathematical equation. I called it the consciousness equation, and another one called the enlightenment equation. That was really just me having a play and trying to bring the two. One of my main themes in that book was saying that we don't always have to be so polarized. You don't always have to say it's all about just the mainstream and that's it, just the allopathic medicine and everything else sucks. Or we don't have to say it's all about just the alternatives and the allopathic medicine sucks. I said, there's a happy fusion to be had.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the middle, I think we need to meet as friends, because you'll find that a lot of things benefit from a bit of both.
Yeah.
Sometimes more of that and less of that, but other times more of that and less of that. I've taught in umpteen cancer centres around the world, around the country over the last 10, 15 years. And I've frequently seen these cancer centres are centres that are charitable, and they offer complementary therapies to people going through mainstream cancer treatment. So they're not saying, come here, we'll cure your cancer instead of taking drugs. They're people who are going through mainstream treatment. They're getting medication, surgery, radiotherapy, whatever, but they come to the centres to also receive complementary therapies. And what I noticed over years is people saying, I get much less side effects when I have a Reiki or I have a massage, and it's relaxing me. And people were benefiting. I would always teach a class in the mind-body connection, meditation, visualization, which is beneficial to them as well, not instead of their medicine, but in addition to it. I've always saw a happy fusion between take the best of the West and the best of all the rest, and mix them together. So in the book, I had a wee play towards the end, and I said, okay, if we want to continue doing that, I mean, now we're into kind of spiritual ideas. As the book got further on, we moved more into kind of not just science and complementary therapies, but spirituality. And I created these little equations that are very based loosely on they're gravity equations, but they basically predict that the more two people feel connected, then emotionally connected, the more one person's consciousness might impact upon the others, no matter how far away, no matter how far apart you are. And that's maybe why some people who feel really connected with a family member, even though the family member's on the other side of the world, they just know when something's happened. And these are sometimes referred to as telesomatic events, but there's loads and loads of evidence like that. And so I had thought in the future, probably not for a while, that I might take ideas in spirituality and show a mathematical parallel, that it's just the same thing in a different language. And that it's just, I don't know how far down the line that is, but I have come up with a few other equations that seem to mirror stuff, the transcendence, states of transcendence and enlightenment. And there's equations that if you change what the letters, what the variables, call it in maths, the letters stand for, then you can actually see the same effect in maths as you do in life itself. But I don't know how good I would be at simplifying or making that kind of book accessible, because most people, when they hear the word maths, they go, oh my God, I think it's all about numbers, but maths is really about relationships. It's not, numbers is the last thing. I mean, when I did my mathematics exam, 4th year mathematics exam, the last question was the biggest one, like 16 marks, but only 1 mark was given for a numerical answer. 15 marks previous to that was deriving a relationship. If that does this, then, and this does that, then these things over here will react in this way. And the majority of maths is just, it's like how we describe relationships, and this happened and that happened. Maths does exactly the same, but it does it in a wee equation, and it describes relationships. And in that big question, 15 marks took me 5 pages of derivations before I got to actually punching numbers into the calculator, which is only really worth 1 mark because it's just numbers. The rest of it is describing the relationship. So I think there's something to be had for me in the future to use a mathematical way, but an accessible way for everybody, even school children, to understand spiritual aspects of the world, because I don't think anyone's really gone there in that capacity. So I experimented a bit with why woo-woo works, and just like 3 pages. So people have not read it. You can skip over those 3 pages if you really want. But
I read them, but I was a wee bit like, what? I had to think about it.
I think it's interesting. Again, we spoke before about if you read your books from the very first one through to Why Woo Woo Works, as it tells a story, it tells your story about where you are at that particular point in time. It's fascinating. And again, I've always said the one that's resonated the most with me is I Heart Me. And again, I think I've mentioned it before, that the talk
where you are in your journey.
Exactly, the talk you did at that particular point in time, and it was just, I recognised so much of it within myself. And as Kelly pointed out before, and I'm still bad for it, is self-love, is giving too much of my love away, and you burn out.
I give him a row for it.
I do. I get a row.
It's funny. I had never in my life imagined that I would ever write a book on self-love. Ever. It's funny, but the subject just didn't interest me at all. I don't know if this is just a guy thing. I don't know. But it just never interested me. I remember actually when Louise Hay was alive. Now, I spoke at several conferences that Louise Hay spoke at. So oftentimes, I think at least a dozen times I spoke at a conference when Louise Hay and Wayne Dyer were speaking, and I was on after Wayne actually twice. And it was great times. But whenever Louise did a talk on self-love, somehow something happened that I wasn't in the audience to see it. But when she spoke on other subjects, it was brilliant. And now I listen to stuff on the Hay House of an audio app that I listen to most days now, and I listen to meditations with Louise and all that. And it's really in some of her teachings. But I always managed to not pay attention to the self-love stuff. And it was only when I had to, when I realized that so much of my life was challenging and difficult. And I realized, that the only way I could deal with this, the only way I could solve these challenges was to learn how to love myself, how to have compassion for myself, treat myself with kindness, treat myself with respect, all these different aspects of self-love. And my dog Oscar came into my life 2 days before I started working on that book, and he passed away 2 days before it finished. But that talk you referred to, that when we first kind of chatted about things, Oscar had just passed away. And I found myself at this wee Mind, Body, Spirit fair at that hotel. What's the hotel called? The Alona Hotel in Motherwell. Yeah. And I was doing a talk on self-love, on what aspects of the book. And I didn't mean to, but I started talking about Oscar. And I got really emotional and really kind of vulnerable. And I couldn't stop crying because it was so raw. And I remember a woman come up on the stage and give me a big hug, and it felt like magical. It was just what I needed. I just needed somebody to give me a hug. I have no idea. I don't know who it was, but thank you, whoever it was. It was just such a great thing that I remember. But that was a breakthrough for me, because recognizing that it's okay to be vulnerable, because I learned that from Oscar. Because a couple of months later, in fact, it was just a couple of weeks later, I was at a big conference, and I thought, I'm not going to, crying front stage again. And I was 700 people in London. And I remember, I didn't mean to, again, I got onto the subject of talking about Oscar, because I was talking about lessons that I'd learned and stuff, and I got really emotional. But this time it was kind of weird, because technically official book launch, really technically, the first big international conference. And I found myself crying again. But I remember, as I was getting emotional, trying not to cry, go, try to take deep breaths. And I remember what was going through my head at that point was 700 people here that are thereabouts, and they're perceiving me as a teacher. And I've just written this book, and it's literally just out. And what are they going to think of me as a writer and as a teacher who's supposed to have the answers, and he's a gibbering mess up on the stage, And what was going through my head is thinking, no one will buy my book now. God, I need to man up. I need to toughen up and get grip with myself and show them how I can turn this around as a kind of man. And I remember the thought occurred to me, identical thought I had at that one in Motherwell. Who cares? Mm-hmm. I won't cheapen the memory of my connection I had with Oscar by trying to pretend that I can just take a breath and I'm fine. And I thought, who cares whether anyone buys my book? Maybe the most important thing isn't about me trying to show how manly I am, how quickly, supposedly manly it is to not be able to cry. I mean, even calling it manly, it's just stuff that's ingrained in the psyche, isn't it? And I thought maybe the most important thing right now is to just be myself and allow myself to be how I need to be. And so I just cried and just didn't bother. And identical, someone ran up the stage and gave me a hug. Now, what was amazing is, having been afraid that no one will buy my book sold out in 2 minutes. Oh. In fact, Hay House were sending people out into London to bookshops to buy their stock because they'd none left, literally within 2 minutes. And that was an amazing learning for me, that, you don't need to be, one of the most important things isn't to put a front on and show people a shiny version of yourself, but you just be honest and authentic, because then we can relate to each other properly, And I first learned that properly at that talk when we first met, and I kind of underlined it a few weeks later at that bigger London conference.
It's beautiful. I actually looked at the picture. I got a picture taken with you at it, and I looked at myself in it, and I looked like a different person. I think that it's a bit cliched, but the gateway to the soul is through your eyes, and I looked like a different person. I was in a different place in my life at that point in time. Yeah. And I look at myself now, and I'm glad to say that I'm a weirdo. So it's great, and you've played a huge part in that. We were talking about connection earlier on. Our second unofficial date was actually at one of your talks.
Is that right?
And excuse me for being a bit cheesy and mushy for a second, but I'd never felt connection like that with anybody in my life. The energy, you could literally feel this energy radiating off a person. Thought, what is this? I don't know whether to be happy or scared. So you've absolutely played a huge part in that. Now I know for a fact that we're not the only ones. So it's an amazing thing that you're doing.
That's being kind to yourself, though, as well, isn't it? Kindness isn't always just about being happy and making everyone happy. It's about being able to sit with all your emotions and be kind to yourself and let yourself feel that sadness. Because if you don't, you're going to have it stuck inside.
Because if we try to, kind of block it out and put on a front for other people, then we're not actually authentically honouring ourselves. We're not, like you said, we're not being kind to ourselves because we're just trying to get someone to like us. Because I think deep in our psyche is this, or in the surface of our psyche is this idea that if people don't like us, it's a threat to our survival. It's because we have genes, I call them kindness genes, but they're also connection genes. They're some of the oldest in the human genome, like 500 million years old and 4 hours. No, not the 4 hours, but like 500 million years old. And so they have been conserved or preserved, if you will, all through hundreds of millions of years because they're so vitally important. And what that means is we absolutely need connection.
Yeah.
I think somehow we've kind of got it back to front in our modern everyday lives. We think that if someone doesn't like me, then that's because connection is also meant for our ancient ancestors, it meant survival. If you don't have connection, then you're out on your own, you don't survive. So in our psyche, we think if they don't like me, then I won't connect. It's a threat to survival. So it feels a threat. So we have this drive to want people to like us and to accept us. And what we learn to do is try to present a front to people that we think they'll most like. Yeah. But then we've got to change it to someone else, and we've got to keep maintaining that front. But by doing that, you'll never get the actual real connection that your psyche and your genome, your body requires. Mm-hmm. The best way to get it, counterintuitively, is to stop trying to get people to like you and stop putting on a front, but to let the guard down and just be your honest, authentic self. And sometimes that's just the person that's struggling today. It's having a bad day and just sitting with it. And then connection is authentic, it's honest, and that allows the other person to let their guard down. And then connection is real.
I think for that to happen, that's where people sometimes need to go and heal things, because that goes back to your childhood. And it's talking about your attachments to your parents and your caregivers. And without getting into it too much, but you've got 4 different types of attachment. One's a secure attachment, and the other 3 are insecure. And if you feel that insecure attachment, you're constantly trying to get a connection with someone, or you're scared to get a connection because you're going to get hurt. So it's going back to healing those childhood traumas so that you're not feeling like you need everyone to like you. If someone doesn't like you, you're like, oh, well, they're not my type of person.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I had to learn a lot when I was writing I Heart Me. That's the longest it's ever taken me to write a book.
Wow.
Because I started writing it intellectually, but you can't write a book on self-love intellectually. You know, I can quote studies. In fact, when I wrote the first version, I remember sitting down, my publisher, the MD of Hay House, Michelle Pilley, asked me if I could meet her for a wee coffee. And she said, and I thought, oh, that's unusual. Usually she just said, great book, fantastic. Let's get through the editorial process. And she said, I'm really sorry to say we can't accept this book in the form it is. She said, if we publish this as it is, it will be damaging to your career.
Wow.
Because I tried to take a book on self-love, write a book about self-love, but all I'd done was quote academic studies. I hadn't done any transformation myself. And I hadn't learned anything about self-love. I was speaking from an academic perspective, not from a felt perspective. Yeah. And this is why I like your comment. You said, looking at my books over the years, I've really charted my own history, because that's where I was at that point. And I realized then that, Michelle, I got a bit emotional and realizing that I hadn't dealt with any of my own stuff, which is the whole point of writing the book, was so that I knew that self-love was the answer to some of my challenges in life, and realization that in the 5 or 6 months I'd spent on the book, I'd learned nothing and progressed in no way at all. And Michelle said, look, how about we forget the deadline? Just no deadline. Just you take as long as you need to write this book. And when you feel you're ready, let's talk about it again. We can work out a publication date. That's an amazing thing for a publisher to say. Yeah. You usually get deadlines and everything's got to be ticked off and signed off and stuff. It's amazing freedom that she offered me there in writing. And that's when I started to really learn. That's when I started to really work on the experiential side, which took me into the loss of Oscar and all that kind of stuff. And the book took me another 18 months to write after then. But I really learned what self-love was, not just from an intellectual, but from an experiential point of view. So the book, it's the only book I'd written that at that point that was actually teaching a lot of exercises, because I did all of them myself. And these are the things that worked for me. And so it was far more experiential, and I did that because I needed it. Yeah. And essentially I wrote the book for myself. The book was really just what I was learning as I was going through the point of learning to love myself, and I just happened to write it down as I was doing it.
When I read it, I thought, I wish I had this when I was a teenager. We keep trying to get our teenagers to read it, but trying to get them off social medias an issue.
Yeah.
No, it's great. Something that I wanted to mention was you said about like trying to connect the medicine world with the more spiritual world. Because for me, my first protocol when I don't feel good is always like going through a checklist of, have I been kind to myself? Have I been eating well? Have I been meditating? All the things that you talk about in your book. Have I been out in nature? I do cold baths. Have I did that recently? Before I would go to a doctor and try and like find out or take any medicine for it. But I think a lot of people's first protocol is to go straight to the doctor. They don't make the connection of their environment and things that they've been doing and how that might be affecting them. And they'll take a pill, no questions asked. So I think that's really interesting, like you're saying about maybe bringing the two of them together, because probably for me, I hate but obviously it is needed, so we do need the two of them together.
I think for a great many ailments, doctors would be quite happy to suggest that someone has a holistic therapy instead of taking a tablet. I mean, there's a big growth in the UK in lifestyle medicine.
Yeah.
When GPs, doctors, who are recognising that a lot of the patients presenting to them are presenting with stuff that is reversible if we change, if with a different lifestyle, or at least can be prevented with preventative habits like diet and exercise and managing our stress, from meditation, better sleep, better interactions and all that kind of stuff. And so many of them, what they'll do is someone will come in with a condition, and rather than giving them medication, they'll say, how about we do this lifestyle change?
Yeah.
And I'll keep an eye on you. If you have high blood pressure, let's change the diet, let's get some exercise, manage your stress. And, it might be that if you're able to make this change work, then you might never need to take blood pressure medication. So a lot of doctors are moving in that kind of way, recognising the importance of the lifestyle. But at the same time, a lot of them are also recognising that some of the calming and the restorative effects that we need can actually be supplied from complementary therapies. Because one of the major things that complementary therapies do is they generate a restorative effect in the body. That they're relaxing and calming. So they're putting the body into a parasympathetic state kind of thing. And they're attaching a nice memory and experience to that as well. So a lot of doctors would actually, in the book I called for a closer integration when people could actually be trained by doctors. And I say that because I'm friendly with quite a number of doctors, and I asked a few of them what their thoughts were about stuff, and they said, look, they really love the complementary therapies, but their fear is someone might have a pain and they say, I'll just go get a Reiki instead of going to my doctor. Yeah. But that pain might be masking something more serious that only a doctor would be able to diagnose. So what I suggested in the book is a closer integration where people who want to be closely aligned with health department, health boards, could actually go through some formal training by a doctor, where a doctor might just show them how to look for specific warning signs. Mm-hmm. And if they see any of those warning signs when they're getting their Reiki or their crystal session or their other complementary session, they just say, if they see a warning sign, they go, oh, no, that's one of the things I've been told to look out for. You have to go see your doctor kind of thing. And doctors would be happier if that integration was more formal together, and that communication. And then that would actually allow a lot of doctors to say, well, wait a minute, tons of our patients really need a lifestyle intervention or a good rest. Yeah. So maybe we could offload a lot of patients to complementary therapies, and then that would free up more time for the doctors to take care of the patients who have really serious conditions, who really do need a higher level physical intervention, and it would give the doctors more time for that kind of thing. So that's what I proposed in the book.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
I think so. Something we want to get out of the podcast with everyone we talk to is something that people can, I suppose, take away with them that they can use in everyday life that perhaps take away some of that stress, enhance their life, refocus them a little bit, whatever it may be. I know it's putting you in the spot a little bit, but is there any wee nugget of information, an exercise that you could give people to take away with them to use everyday life?
It sounds corny and overly simple, but just try to be kind as often as you can, but armed with the knowledge that kindness is the opposite of stress. And sometimes when there's challenges afoot, be kind to the person that's challenging you, but also to, in other kind of ways, if it's not a particular person, just circumstances. And you'll find that the kindness itself, because of how it feels, it can build a sense of resilience, and it can be it's a really good antidote for some of the everyday, ordinary stresses that occur in our lives. But secondly, I think kindness is what holds the fabric of human society together, and I think we need to remember that. That despite differences that people might have, it's kindness and compassion and empathy that hold the fabric of human society together. And it's also, kindness is one of the most contagious things. In all the research I've ever done in science, one of the most contagious is kindness. So even when you think what you do isn't significant, you're always having a ripple effect. It's impacting loads more people than you think.
Yeah.
So just be kind. That's my simple advice. It's not rocket science, but it does have more powerful effects than you would think.
Amazing.
Love it.
Listen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it. It's been an absolute pleasure as always.
Yeah, been great. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I always like to have our chats anyway. This has been really great.
No, enjoy it. Kelly's added to the mix now as well. So thanks.
Thanks for both of you. And really insightful questions, and made this this was a nice conversation. It's good.
Yeah, thank you. And for anyone that's not bought it yet, or any of your books for that matter, but your latest book, Why Woo Woo Works.
Yeah, it's amazing. You
can get that in all places you can buy books, I suppose. Brilliant. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you. Bye.